ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕਾ ਖਾਲਸਾ ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕੀ ਫਤਿਹ. Welcome to another segment of Khoj Gurbani's a-sabad-a-day. The recitation today is composition of the fifth Nanak, Guru Arjan, and the recitation. Gauri Mahalla Panjava Salok Patit Asankh Punit Kar Punho Punho Balihar ਨਾਨਕ ਰਾਮ ਨਾਮ ਜਪੇ ਪਾਵ ਕੋ ਤਿਨ ਕਿਲ ਬਿਖ ਦਾਹਨ ਹਾਰ ਛੰਤ ਜਪ ਮਨਾ ਤੂੰ ਰਾਮ ਨਾਰਾਇਣ ਗੋਵਿੰਦਾ ਹਰਿ ਮਾਧੋ ਧਿਆਏ ਮਨਾ ਮੁਰਾਰ ਮੁਕੰਦੇ ਕਟਿਏ ਕਾਲ ਦੁਖ ਫਾਤੋ ਦੁਖ ਹਰਨ ਦੀਨ ਸਰਣ ਸ੍ਰੀਧਰ ਚਰਨ ਕਮਲ ਆਰਾਧੀਐ ਜਮ ਪੰਥ ਬਿਖੜਾ ਅਗਨ ਸਾਗਰ ਨਿਮਖ ਸਿਮਰਤ ਸਾਧੀਐ ਸਿਮਰ ਮਨਾ ਦਾਮੋਦਰ ਦੁਖ ਹਰ ਭੈ ਭੰਜਨ ਹਰਿ ਰਾਇਆ ਸ੍ਰੀ ਰੰਗੋ ਦਿਆਲ ਮਨੋਹਰ ਭਗਤ ਵਛਲ ਬਿਰਦਾਇਆ ਭਗਤ ਵਛਲ ਪੁਰਖ ਪੂਰਨ ਮਨਹਿ ਚਿੰਦਿਆ ਪਾਈਐ ਤਮ ਅੰਧਕੂਪ ਤੇ ਉਧਾਰੇ ਨਾਮ ਮਨੈ ਵਸਾਈਐ ਸੁਰ ਸਿੱਧ ਗਣ ਗੰਧਰਵ ਮੁਨ ਜਨ ਗੁਣ ਅਨੇਕ ਭਗਤੀ ਗਾਇਆ ਬਿਨਵੰਤ ਨਾਨਕ ਕਰੋ ਕਿਰਪਾ ਪਾਰ ਬ੍ਰਹਮ ਹਰਿ ਰਾਇਆ ਚੇਤ ਮਨਾ ਪਾਰ ਬ੍ਰਹਮ ਪਰਮੇਸ਼ਰ ਸਰਬ ਕਲਾ ਜਿਨੀ ਧਾਰੀ ਕਰੁਣਾ ਮੈਂ ਸਮਰੱਥ ਸੁਆਮੀ ਘਟ ਘਟ ਪ੍ਰਾਣ ਆਧਾਰੀ ਪ੍ਰਾਣ ਮਨ ਤਨ ਜੀ ਦਾਤਾ ਬੇਅੰਤ ਅਗਮ ਅਪਾਰੋ ਸਰਣ ਜੋਗ ਸਮਰੱਥ ਮੋਹਨ ਸਰਬ ਦੋਖ ਬਿਦਾਰੋ ਰੋਗ ਸੋਗ ਸਭੇ ਦੋਖ ਬਿਨਸੈ ਜਪਤ ਨਾਮ ਮੁਰਾਰੀ ਬਿਨਵੰਤ ਨਾਨਕ ਕਰੋ ਕਿਰਪਾ ਸਮਰੱਥ ਸਭ ਕਲ ਧਾਰੀ ਗੁਣ ਗਾਓ ਮਨਾ ਅਚੁੱਤ ਅਬਨਾਸੀ ਸਭ ਤੇ ਊਚ ਦਿਆਲਾ ਬਿਸਵੰਬਰ ਦੇਵਨ ਕੋ ਏਕੈ ਸਰਬ ਕਰੇ ਪ੍ਰਿਤਪਾਲਾ ਪ੍ਰਿਤਪਾਲ ਮਹਾਦਿਆਲ ਦਾਨਾ ਦਇਆ ਧਾਰੇ ਸਭ ਕਿਸੈ ਕਾਲ ਕੰਟਕ ਲੋਭ ਮੋਹ ਨਾਸੈ ਜੀ ਜਾਂ ਕੇ ਪ੍ਰਭ ਬਸੈ ਬਿਨਵੰਤ ਨਾਨਕ ਇਛ ਪੁਨੀ ਜਪਤ ਦੀਨ ਦਿਆਲਾ ਕਾਲ ਕੰਠਕ ਲੋਭ ਮੋਹ ਨਾਸੈ ਜੀ ਜਾ ਕੇ ਪ੍ਰਭ ਬਸੈ ਬਿਨਵੰਤ ਨਾਨਕ ਇਛ ਪੁਨੀ ਜਪਤ ਦੀਨ ਦਿਆਲਾ. So this passage begins with a salok, a prologue if you will, that is a dedication. And the dedication is to that self who is named Ram and whose realization burns the impurities of the ego and awakens us to cosmic consciousness. To that self, to that Ram, Guru Arjan says, I offer my salutations over and over again. Patit Asankh Punit Kar Punho Punho Balihar. Patit Asankh Punit Kar. Patit, one who is sinful or one who has fallen from virtue, also one who is not awakened in consciousness. In other words, one who is still in ego consciousness. Patit. Patit Asankh Punit Kar. Punit is the opposite. Awakened consciousness. pure of the mind. In other words, the residue of the ego is gone. So the Guru says, I offer my salutations to that one self whose realization can bring that awakening in consciousness. And then the chant begins with the injunction on how to carry ourselves in this process. And he says, Japa mana tu Ram, Narayan, Govinda, Har Madho. So, therefore, engage the mind in the process of realizing the all-pervading Ram self that is also present in you. Japa mana tu Ram. And the wise also call it Narayan, meaning the refuge of the world, Govinda, who's the protector, Har, is the consciousness, cosmic consciousness, Madho, the sweet beloved, as well as Murar, the destroyer of demons, and Mukande, the giver of liberation. So we see here that Guru Arjan very beautifully has woven into this verse the different attributes and the different names by which the self has been called or named within the Indian traditions. As we know, the Gurus took what was prevailing, the language, and gave it a new meaning. That was one of their genius. And here you see all of those names, Har, Madho, Murar, Mukande, Govinde, Narayan. These are all names from within the Bhakti tradition. And they're all names that are attributable to Krishna, but unlike Krishna Bhagats that actually have images of Krishna, here the self within, the unfathomable self, is being given these names as part of his attributes. I use the word his because language is very constricting. You could call it it. So engage the mind with the process of realization, which is Nama Jap. And then he says, make this your daily worship. So what should your daily worship consist of? Dinasaren Aradho. What should your worship look like? Here are the components. Recite, reflect on the mantra of Gurbani and internalize your attention. Dhyaye mana murar mukande. So this should be your daily worship. Dinasaran aradho. How do you aradho? Dhyaye mana murar mukande. When you do this, the illusion of death is shattered because the mind is now constantly aware of the timeless self, you see, the self that is imperishable. And you realize that we are reflections of the self, of the same nature. And that makes it easier to cross over the treacherous ocean of fire, which is existence. Jama pant bikhra. Difficult it is. Agana sagar nimak simbarat sadiya. In a flash, when you realize the self, in a flash, you swim across. Again, my mind, remain in constant awareness of the herself, the Guru says. For the self contains the universe, the Modar, and it is the destroyer of all fear. Dukh har bhavanjan. And the herself directs the world playfully and with compassion. Sri Rango Dayal. Rango, playful, with love. And the self is enchanting. Manohar. If you recall in the previous passage, the term Mohan was used. This is a derivative. Manohar, one that enchants the mind. And it is in the nature of the self to love its devotees. So through self-knowledge, in other words, knowledge of the self, the Guru says, climb out of the blind well that you find yourself trapped in. And this blind well really is the world and the world of the senses that keeps us in a state of unconsciousness, spiritually speaking, that is. And the Guru ends this passage, this verse, by saying, warriors, perfected ones, your servants, sages, devotees are all singing to your glory. Sur Siddh Gan Gan Dharba Mun Jan Gun Anik Bhakta Bhakti Gaya. So therefore Nanak seeks the gift of praise so that he can also sing to the glory. So always be guided by awareness of the Supreme Self. Chetamana Parbaram Paramesar. Because this Supreme Self dawns the repository of all skills. Sarabakala Jinatari. And the Self is compassionate. It is complete in all respects. And it is the support of life. Karuna mein Samarat Swami Ghat Pran Adhari. And it is the source of our breath, Prana Mantan Jidata. It is boundless and unfathomable. That is the self that we have to realize. And you do that by assimilating in your person virtues of this imperishable and immovable self. Gun Gao Mana Achut Abanasi, who is very compassionate. Sabate Uj Dayalla. So it is this self alone that preserves the universe and cares for it. Viswambar Devan ko ekka, sarab kare pratapalla. So the self is the giver who nurtures every being with kindness. Pratapala Mahadayal Dana Daya Tare Sab Kise. So when we realize the self, the fear of death is removed. Kal Kantak Lobha Mohanase, as is greed and avarice. And when the self is pleased, in other words, when we find the embrace of the self, our worship bears fruit. So prasanna deva safala seva bhay puran kalla. So by the process of jap, the self is realized. So declares Nanak. On that note, until the next time, Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.